Joy's Way, a map for the Transformational Journey by Dr. Brugh Joy. This is the second part of Chapter 1. Perhaps more than belief systems and conditioning, the emotions, whether consciously perceived or acting subconsciously, seem to be one of the major experiencing mechanisms that dominate the perspective of an individual. Whatever prompts them, emotional responses are undoubtedly valid experiences. That is, they really happen, but we must ask whether the emotional kind of response is truly appropriate, or whether we have other options of experience, either in combination with or outside of the emotional reflex arc. Does the emotional reflex augment or restrict our appreciation of the life experience? I believe that in the overwhelming majority of individuals, emotions are restrictive. The emotional responses are relatively primitive, powerful, reactive experiences that are understood poorly, if understood at all. I believe that some of the negative qualities of emotion, such as anger, fear, hostility, and depression, are functioning properly only when they lead to insight, or when they act as a signal to the outer mind that a flaw in perception or in understanding is occurring. This attitude towards the emotions can be appreciated only when we actually know that there are ways to discharge energy other than through emotions, and when we realize that the negative response is a signal from inside and not a fact of reality from outside. Your fear does not mean there is necessarily a danger, and your depression does not mean that you are at the bottom. The training of a physician illustrates emotional deconditioning and reconditioning, and the replacement of the emotional response with other, more appropriate ways to discharge energy. As an undergraduate before medical school, the student's basic intrinsic emotional level is conditioned by and keyed into the general emotional reaction patterns of his or her family unit, which in turn interacts with the social structure in which the family lives. In medical school, the student's pattern of emotional response almost instantly begins to break down, because with little warning it's assaulted by the introduction of the dissection of a dead human being, a cadaver. Let me illustrate with details from my own training. I clearly remember the first day of anatomy class at the beginning of medical school. Each team of 4 students was issued a body to study for the entire year. The bodies, instead of lying conveniently on dissection tables, were enclosed in plastic bags and stacked on shelves in another room. Each came with the following information: a name, age at death if known, a brief history of the last illness, which was withheld from us so that we could discover during the course of study what events must have taken place to cause the death of our cadaver, and whether the body was willed to the school or was an unclaimed derelict who had died in Skid Row area or in the county hospital. The bodies were saturated with formaldehyde. To prevent our cadaver's desiccation during the year's study, my partners and I had to cart the cadaver over to the dissection room, move it from the plastic bag, grease the entire body with a substance similar to petroleum jelly, and then wrap it with jelly-impregnated gauze, carefully covering each individual finger and toe, the nose, the ears, as well as the entire body. Interestingly, all 7 women medical students in my class seemed to breeze through this stage without emotional consequences, while 5 or 6 of the male students experienced fainting, nausea, and vomiting, lightheadedness, and other physical reactions to their emotional responses. Whatever my emotional nature had been before, I knew without question that I was going to have to respond to this experience as much as possible without emotion. My psychological defenses included denial that the cadaver represented a human being like me. It was more like an object of interest and study that reflected a structure similar to my own. And of course, like all medical students, I defended myself with humor. My point here is that without control over our emotional nature, we cannot probe or extend our experience of life. The medical student knows that the cadaver is only the beginning of the initiation into the realm of medical science. Still to come are the confrontations with the dying aged, not too difficult, the dying child, very emotionally charged, and the dying person of 20 to 25, the student's own age, probably the most difficult to encounter. And then the actual death and post-mortem on a person one has cared for medically. During the post-mortem examination, the body is not gray, stiff, and leathery as in the anatomy lab. These dead are pale, flaccid, and appear to be asleep or drowsing. My first post-mortem was on a child of 4. It took every effort of my beingness not to react to the procedure as my emotions were prompting me to do, but from a new perspective, I was finally able to study the body and proceed with the post-mortem without emotional response. Then I was able to see the magnificence of the death process and the beauty of the lifeless shell of the individual who had animated this form. At that point, I became able to understand that my emotional response had been based on my own fears of death and dying, and that those ideas were generated not out of reality, but out of the stories that I'd heard or read or seen in movies, and out of my reaction to the death of close relatives. The reconditioning of my entire response pattern into a new option when exposed to death or dying was a fundamental experience that gave birth to an important experiential insight. Given sufficient motivation, conditioned patterns of response can be altered. The possibility of negative consequences, loss of sensitivity, perhaps suppression, sublimation, or even repression, had not yet entered my consciousness. But the positive reward was clear. A beginning mastery over emotional responses would allow me new dimensions of perception that had been previously unavailable or blocked by the emotional expression. The basic insight about the control of the emotions later grew gradually into the concepts of the transmutation of sexual and emotional energies, so that I was able to envision the psychological tools needed to overcome neurosis engendered by repression. Simultaneously held paradoxical belief systems, contradictions, often pop up in patients or observers in an emergency room. On the one hand, these people admire the physician at work, but on the other, they also condemn the doctor as insensitive to what is actually happening, that is, to death, to traumatic injury that may have consequences for a lifetime, or to the emotional responses of the patient's family. When people insist that the emotions must be given free expression, I often ask them to relate the consequences of their contention to emergency room physicians. If these physicians were to react emotionally to the sight of the injured coming in from an automobile accident or a fire, to the feelings of a patient's family due to their use to society would be lost. Physicians who have mastered their emotions, in distinction to those who repress emotions, are persons who can, when they choose, express and experience emotion, who have a deeper understanding of what their own emotional nature is, and who are capable of sensitive responses to the human beings in times of crisis, rather than cold, icy intellectuals who defend themselves from emotional responses. Note that the key here is that the physician can choose. The more highly developed the individual soul, the greater the number of options of response. The first stage of developing mastery over the emotions is holding them in check, either by psychological defense mechanisms or by the technique of identifying with what is called the witness aspect of consciousness. The witness aspect will be covered in more detail later. Then comes the insights and the new experiences that feed back into the psyche new response patterns and new understanding, leading eventually to a complete reevaluation and renovation of the individual emotional pattern. The individual is then capable of acting rather than reacting. The following section is intentionally designed to evoke several strong emotional responses conditioned by society. I ask you to keep in the back of your mind the overview that these reactions are centered in culturally engendered ideas about reality and are not the only reactions possible to given cues. And then it says in brackets here, if aspects of death and dying are particularly distasteful, please proceed to page 28, second paragraph. Okay, right now we're on page 24, so I would imagine like a few minutes ahead in this audio. Continuing now, a good example of the variation of emotional responses from a single cue or idea would be different people's reaction to the ideas of cremation or of embalming of the human corpse. First of all, let's emotionally charge the idea even further by using words that elicit stronger reactions. In cremation, we are burning or charring a body who has died, rendering the body to ashes and bony fragments through fire and the use of some blunt instrument. Then, in the West, we usually sweep up the remains into a container to put into a mausoleum, the ground, or the ocean, or to be scattered over the earth. In the East, the remains are swept from the burning area directly into water, usually a river. I would venture to say that most people in the West react negatively and strongly to this kind of treatment of a formerly living human being. I have heard, for example, that it is a sin to cremate a body, that it is primitive and unthinking, that it is ugly and uncaring, that a body must be preserved because at some future time that same body is to return to the same functions as when it was alive, that satanic forces operate when the body is put into the fire, that the process of cremation is inhumane for the departed soul who might have to experience the fire, that is, a desecration of the life form to destroy the body in such a way, that there is no rest for the departed soul when the body is destroyed, and so on. In our Western culture, Jews and Catholics are the two large groups that traditionally do not cremate their dead, though their reasons may not be the ones that I have cited. And there are millions upon millions of other people to whom the idea of cremation is simply unthinkable. But to other millions, perhaps even more millions, it is unthinkable to do anything but cremate the body. These people, predominantly in the East, believe that it's necessary to burn the body in order to liberate the soul, that the soul can't leave the body completely until its form is dissolved, and that the fire represents the sun or God action or transmutation, that the body is of no real consequence in a soul's journey and development, except as a vehicle to be used temporarily and then discarded like an old clothing at death. These ideas are certainly startlingly different, But now, I want to suggest something that may be equally shocking in a different way. Is it possible that both these polarities, along with the entire intermediate area of response between them, are equally valid? Can it be that they depend upon the perspective of the individual rather than upon reality? Is it possible that in truth it really doesn't matter or make any difference, that all these emotional reactions about life and death are based more upon fear and immature thinking than on understanding? If you are a conventional Westerner made uncomfortable by the idea of cremation, you may be intrigued by what observers would see if they follow a body, perhaps yours, from death in the hospital to burial in the cemetery. The usual practice is to attempt to protect bereaved survivors from the reality of death, to make it seem sweet and gentle. As soon as a person dies in hospital, any tubes that were placed into the body, veins, trachea, stomach, bladder, or whatever, are removed. The eyes are closed by bringing the lids down with finger pressure. The sheets are usually changed if they are badly soiled, and the blanket and sheet are drawn up to the chin. The arms are placed at the sides or on the chest, and the legs are straightened out. A pillow is placed under the head. Only then is the family allowed to view the body. Later, after the viewing, with the family safely out of the way, the rectum is packed. The penis may be tied with a string to prevent bladder leakage, or the vagina may be packed for the same reason. The feet are tied together, the hands are tied together, and an identification tag is placed on the great toe. The body is placed on a stretcher and covered with pillows and a large cloth, so that it isn't obvious what is being transported through the corridors to the morgue, usually located in the obscurity of the basement of the ground floor of the hospital. No one except authorized personnel, physicians or morticians, and their aides is allowed into the section of the hospital. Innocent bystanders must be protected from accidental contact with the realities of death. The body is stored in a large refrigerator until autopsy or until the mortician is called. Usually, but not always, a white sheet covers the entire body. Rigor mortis, the stiffening of the body, occurs in a matter of hours. It later breaks in quotes, spontaneously. It later breaks spontaneously, so that by the time the usual autopsy is performed, the body is again flaccid. If the body is embalmed before autopsy, however, it will have been stiffened by chemical action. If the autopsy is to be performed, the body is removed from the refrigerator and placed on the dissection table, a large rectangular structure with stainless steel top and gutters or sloping indentations to catch the body fluids during the dissection and convey them to a sink at the floor of the table. If a full autopsy has been granted by the family, the chest cavity is opened first by an incision through the skin with a scalpel, and then a power saw and a chisel to cut away the breastbone, the sternum, to expose the heart and lungs. The incision into the abdomen is carried from the lower part of the front of the chest to the pubic bone. If the brain is to be examined, then while the pathologist works on removing the organs, the assistant uses the power saw to take off the entire top of the skull in order to remove the brain. Before the skull bone is put back, however, an incision is made from the back of the scalp to the base of the head and is carried up behind each ear so that the scalp can be pulled over the top of the head, thus offering access to the skull. The scalp flap rests over the face. If the brain is not to be examined, the face is usually covered with a cloth. Every organ is carefully inspected and weighed, and tissue samples are taken to be mounted on slides for study under the microscope. The eyes and face are usually not touched, nor are the genitalia, legs, feet, arms, and hands. After the organs are removed, the spine is inspected from the front, and usually a piece of bone marrow is taken, also from the front, from the lumbosacral area. To help the mortician in the embalming process, the pathologist may tie off all the major vessels that were cut during the dissection, but few pathologists are so considerate. The removed organs are then randomly replaced into the body cavity. The brain is not put back, but is usually placed in a liquid to fix in quotes, to fix it for several days before it is examined. Before embalming or fixation, the brain is a jelly-like substance, excuse me, and the fixation process firms it up so that it's easier to handle. The skull cap is put in place and the flap of scalp pulled back over the head and sutured, closing the body. When the mortician picks up the body, he places it in a black or blue or dark blue cover sheet or bag and transports it to a windowless black or white truck to the embalming parlor. What happens to it there has been well covered in such books as The High Cost of Dying and The Loved One. The essence of the mortician's talents is to erase, as completely as possible, all clues that the person has died. The body is dressed in his or her best clothes. Usually there are no shoes, and only the parts of the body that are carefully prepared are the ones that can be seen: the face, the upper torso, the arms and hands. Next comes the funeral. If all is done with great dignity, the music is beautiful, the flowers are beautiful, the body is beautiful, and the mourners, however grief-stricken, are left with the impression, certainly not denied by the mortician, that the body will remain forever beautiful. Such, unfortunately, is not the case. Depending on the attention paid by the mortician and the money paid by the family, the body goes into an immediate state of decomposition in 6 weeks to 2 years. In 10 years, the body cannot be considered intact. Only the clothing, the skeleton, the hair, the teeth, fingernails, and the toenails, and portions of skin remain. Observing the entire death and disposal process, one gets the feeling that the person is not really allowed to be dead, held back or not for his or her own sake, but for the sake of the living left behind. Even in those of us who know all these facts about death and dying, our belief systems and the emotional responses they evoke lead to a rationale that is almost impossible to understand. Why not present the objective, natural aspects of death to our awareness? Why not let ourselves come into some understanding of the gigantic deception in which we all participate at one time or another? How can we appreciate reality if we constantly adulterate it in order to conceal some aspect that is emotionally upsetting? Mollifying the emotions, and as a consequence, preventing or experiencing of reality, is a major pattern for much modern civilization, especially in the West. This unreal reality constantly strives to conceal anything that doesn't fit into the culture's belief system. People in the East feel that the Westerner is unbelievably body-oriented, to the point of irrationality. The Western identification of the self with the body, along with the shrouding over of the actual death process, really limits our appreciation of the totality of life. I must agree and state that the culprit in this plot against our perceiving reality is the unbridled emotional reactions. Few people realize, or are willing to realize, that the physical body does not die in one brief moment. In the fields of medicine and law, there is a major controversy going on over what constitutes death of the body. Science has progressed to the point of sustaining the body without one or more of the major organs: brain, heart, kidneys, adrenal glands, pancreas, most of the gastrointestinal tract, the reproductive organs, spleen, spinal column, the lungs, for various periods of time, from hours to years, either by using mechanical devices or through organ transplants. Almost all authorities, whether legal or medical, would agree that when the central nervous system, i.e. the brain, is destroyed, legal death has occurred. But actually the body dies over a much longer period of time. Although the brain dies in minutes, the cells that produce hair and nails continue to survive for many months after the person has been buried. Ironically, the cellular death is actually delayed by the embalming procedure, which stops the natural decomposition of the flesh. At some point in the not-too-distant future, science will learn how to unblock the mechanism by which a protein, undifferentiated cell, turns into whatever specialized cell or cells it is to become. Then it will be possible to take the long-surviving cells from hair or nails and stimulate them into producing entire physical beings. If this differentiation process seems far-fetched, please remember that we all begin that way. Our physical form appears from a single cell, undifferentiated at conception, with cellular material from the mother's ovum and genetic material from both parents. The work of Dr. Harold Saxon Burr, B-U-R-R, Ph.D. at Yale University, suggests that this developing cell, the zygote, is surrounded by a field of energy that, independent of the nucleus of the cell, initiates and controls at least the basic growth axis of the cell. In other words, growth at this stage, despite the hypothesis prevalent in science today, may not be entirely under the control of the genes. Some radical thinkers, including me, even suggest that this energy field constitutes a still more fundamental unit of our beingness that is subphysical and more fundamental than the physical. Perhaps an energy manifestation in the zone between the physical and non-physical, an interdimensional link that modern science has not even dreamed about. Thus, we reach the field of physics by way of the protein cell and the energy field. As you may know, from even slight knowledge of modern physics, matter is not what our physical senses report it as being. Our senses tell us that our bodies are solid, real objects, encased in a solid, real skin covering. These realities are what we experience as our physical selves. We are unaware of our body's activities at the cellular level, let alone the molecular and atomic levels, and to approach the subatomic levels and relate them to our own form and structure is mostly intellectual ideation and not in any way experiential. After my mystical experiences, or hallucinogenic drug experiences, however, a few people report having felt cellular, atomic, and subatomic activities in their bodies. These reports are relatively rare, but what is most interesting about them is that science does not recognize these experiences as valid. In this instance, two specializations, subsumed under the general name of science, hold conflicting belief systems. The biological sciences tell us that we cannot experience what the physical sciences tell us is reality. Such contradictions and denials are characteristic in science. Prevalent theory at any time is apt to deny even the possibility of something that is just over the horizon. From the ancient Greeks to the present, awareness of the human body has progressed from the level of the gross form and structure to the level of the organ systems, to the cellular level, to the molecular level, to the submolecular level, and finally to the atomic and subatomic levels. On these latter levels, we don't find matter. We only find swirling and oscillating fields of energy. And between these observable energy interactions, we find an unbelievable amount of what appears to be nothingness. The truth is that our bodies, like all matter, are composed of a great deal of nothingness and a smidgen of matter or energy interaction. An atomic nucleus and its electrons are both energies. The distance between them relative to their sizes is in proportion to the distance between the sun and the earth. There is a vast amount of nothingness. In modern physics, one current theory holds that all matter, and thus all energy, is actually trapped light. I find this suggestion intriguing because many mystical and cosmic experiences report light of various colors emanating from all objects. This light appears to be intrinsic to an object rather than being reflected from the object. That is, the object itself emits the light and can be seen in total darkness. Without even considering the nature of intrinsic light, with all our sophistications, we do not know what ordinary light is. Our understanding of it is still theoretical. Light and sound are accepted in conventional medicine as energy forces capable of healing. Light, in many frequencies that we know as colors, has been shown to be effective in influencing certain abnormalities of the body. For example, blue light is used to treat jaundiced infants, and the mechanism is clearly known. The frequency of blue light is capable of breaking up the chemical bonding of the bilirubin molecule and thus converting it into a substance less toxic to the central nervous system. For another example, ultraviolet light is used to treat certain skin disorders and in sterilization techniques to kill bacteria and influence virus replication. Suntanning and sunburn are both produced by light beyond the visible frequencies, and when light is produced in a single frequency, as a laser beam, it can make incisions into the body, and outside medicine can cut metals, fabrics, and other materials. Sound is used in orthodox medicine in the form of ultrasonics, sound frequencies far above the range of audible humans. These frequencies are used to vaporize liquids in inhalation therapy for respiratory patients, in diagnostic equipment which bounces sound waves through the body to produce so-called echograms, and in direct application to the body to promote the healing of injured tissue. Down in the ordinary listening ranges, sound in the form of music is used to soothe or calm supermarket shoppers, operating room personnel, and office and factory workers. Sonar uses sound waves in the sea in a way analogous to the diagnostic equipment that makes echograms. And I will share some further insights about sound later in the section about high-intensity sound in the form of music played at high volume as a tool for precipitating expanded experiences in awareness. Although we may recognize that sound and light can influence us psychologically, most of us have not conceived that our psychological aspect, like our physical structure, may be nothing more or less than a configuration of energies. I believe that it is. As I see it, the density of this psychological energy is far less than the density of what we know of as matter, and therefore it is capable of interpenetrating the energy fields that make up matter. Does this information begin to pique your curiosity as to what we really are? Doesn't it begin to shift your attitude about what is real and what is only apparent? If you can see that a body is an energy interaction, can you also see that a disease must be an energy interaction too? Isn't it conceivable then that there are unexplored combinations of energy interaction that may alter a disease energy interaction? Could energy fields produced by human thought be among these therapeutic configurations? Could essential thought before it is shaped into language or ideas, images or visions, be more fundamental than matter itself? Could energy thought even originate matter? Could energy thought even originate matter, create it and its counterpart energy, or at least organize it into forms and structures? What cures is not penicillin or other medicine in tablet or liquid form. What cures is actually a combination of energy forces that is capable of influencing other energy forces. There are many such energy configurations, as yet unknown or denied by science, that can influence the fields of energy that are manifested as the apparent physical form. In starting you towards a beginner's mind, I have introduced here only a few basic concepts. Enough, I hope, for the average reader to feel tilted out of his or her comfortable belief structure about reality and to begin to enter into dimensions of awareness that are based on scientific probing and personal observation, as well as the mystical, spiritual, and holistic experiences of reality. I feel that if more information from many belief systems is presented to a developing human consciousness, there will be less fantasizing and greater application of our potential as conscious beings. The whole subject of belief systems always reminds me of an old story about the blind sages examining the elephant. If we allow ourselves to examine only the tail, or the trunk, or the legs, we come to experience that it is a round tube of varying diameters, and we completely miss the unifying pattern. Even worse, we have created an animal that does not exist. We are, of course, blinded to some extent by our limitations, and it may be that we will never get rid of them entirely. Insofar as is possible, however, let us experience the whole elephant. And that concludes Chapter 1. Chapter 2 is entitled Teachers, Psi Phenomena, and the Hologram Analogy. So I hope you're enjoying this. I certainly am. And till soon.